Welcome to AP Bio Fun with Dr. D. And in today's tutorial, we're going to start talking about natural selection, which is Unit 7 of the AP Bio curriculum. Now, we're going to organize this unit a little bit differently than what is on AP Classroom. And here's a summary of what we're going to be learning in this unit. We're going to be learning about evolution. We have been learning about evolution, but in this unit, we're going to be delving more deeper into it. And I want you to be aware that evolution is both a theory and a process, and we will be exploring both. And first, we're going to explore the theory of evolution as a unifying model, explanation of life as we know it. We're going to explore what the theory entails and what it explains. And we're going to examine the overwhelming evidence for that theory. Second, we will examine evolution as a process. We're going to examine evolution on a small scale, microevolution. We're also going to examine evolutionary process on a large scale, which is known as macroevolution. We're also going to be exploring models of evolutionary relationships called phylogenetic trees or cladograms. And finally, as part of this unit, we will be exploring hypotheses about the origins of life on Earth. Now, the hypotheses of the origins of life on Earth are not part of the theory of evolution, but they are part of this unit. So let's delve right into it. So the theory of evolution, as described by Darwin in his original book, The Origin of Species, or How We Came to Be. Evolution is the unifying theory of biology because it helps us explain and understand everything about life. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. We talk about evolution as the unifying theory and all the evidence that supports it, but we also are talking about evolution as a process. So the two are connected, but there are two different terms, really. And in this slide, you will see a graphic organizer that delineates what evolution is, what the evidence for it is, and how the theory was developed. So it simply summarizes everything we're going to be talking about. So Darwin, in his theory of evolution, explained three broad observations about life. One, the unity of life. Two, the diversity of life. And three, the match between an organism and their environment. Now I'm going to ask you to pause the video right here if you're not in class, because we're going to do this in class together, and think of specific examples for each of these observations. Basically use what you have learned this year and last year in biology and give specific examples of the three observations. And once you give those examples, you can continue with the video. All right. So I would like to remind you something that you already know, but just to be clear, in everyday language, theory is really a hypothesis, a guess. But in science, theories are statements or models that have been tested and confirmed. And theory is just like a level below a scientific law, like the law of gravity. So theories are not absolute and they can change, they can be modified. An example of a theory is the germ theory that states that many communicable diseases are caused by germs, by microorganisms. Theories explain data and observations. Theories can be used to make predictions. And again, theories are not absolute and they can be changed. So let's examine now the observations about life that the theory of evolution helps us answer. Why do so many different animals have the same structures? The arm bones in a human are the same bones as the flipper in a whale. How can we explain this? Why are some basic processes such as transcription, glycolysis, translation the same and they're present in all living organisms? How come? How come we have so much in common? But then on the flip side, why are there so many different animals, so many different plants, so many different fungi, so many different microbes? The variety of life on Earth appears endless. And when we look at sequences of DNA, some sequences are very similar in some groups of organisms, while others are very different. So all these observations can be explained by the theory of evolution. And here's an example of how we can use the theory to make predictions. Now, look at these animals, and can you make the following prediction? Can you answer that question? Do these animals lay eggs? Okay, based on evolutionary relationship, can we predict whether these animals lay eggs or not? So by definition, evolution is change, and evolution is change over time. Organisms come from pre-existing organisms. Okay, so the unity of life. Oh, life shares similar characteristics. You've learned them in middle school, the characteristics of life. Many life forms share common structures. This can all be explained with descent with modification, which is what Darwin called his theory of evolution. He actually never called it evolution. He called it descent with modification. And descent with modification means that we all have a common ancestor, but we have evolved over time to be different from one another. And Darwin proposed that each living species has really descended with changes from another species. And this is known as descent with modification, or also known as common descent. And it is depicted here in a cladogram. We're going to be exploring cladograms later in this unit. So how about the diversity of life? Now, despite having so much in common, all life is unique and different. Think about it. The simplest bacteria and a human being both use glycolysis to extract energy from glucose and turn it into ATP. And ATP is the common currency, energy currency in all living cells. Yet we are so different from a bacterial cells. So life is very, different life forms are unique. They have a lot in common, but they're also very unique. So the reason we have something in common is because of descent of modification, but it's the modification part that makes us all different from each other. So each life form is different and has different adaptations due to natural selection, okay? And natural selection really is the title of this unit. We're gonna be talking about other processes, but natural selection is central to this unit. So every possible space in the biosphere, and we refer to the biosphere as everywhere life can exist on Earth, has a critter that has adapted to live its environment. And I'm going to say this again, okay? Every possible space in the biosphere has a critter that's adapted to its environment. Why? That is also evidence for the match between an organism and their environment. And this is due to natural selection, because only organisms that are well suited to their particular environment will survive and reproduce. So here are some drastic examples. Where do these organisms live? Well, they live in places where you and I cannot. One example here is a lake that is very acidic. It has a lot of sulfur. Ice, the Great Salt Lake in Salt Lake City, which is extremely high concentration of salts. Geysers with temperatures between 70 and 95 degrees Celsius. And ocean vents. Deep ocean vents are so deep in the ocean that no sunlight reaches them. So no photosynthesis is possible at these depths, yet whole ecosystems exist thanks to producers that are able to perform synthesize their own food using oxidation reduction reactions. If you remember, we talked about it in Unit 3, chemoautotrophs. So deep in the ocean vents, whole ecosystem exists because of these strange little producers. How about some examples of a fit between an organism and its environment? And again, we're going to refer back to Unit 3, where we explored aerobic respiration. Oxygen is needed to obtain energy from food in heterotrophs, right? So fish that live in the ocean have gills. These gills help them filter the water and the oxygen which is dissolved in the water and help them extract that oxygen so they can perform aerobic respiration. We are mammals. So we have lungs to obtain oxygen from the atmosphere, from the air. Marine mammals also obtain their oxygen from the air. But since they live in the ocean, they can hold their breath until they surface. So they have adaptations that allow them to store oxygen in their lungs for a long time until they surface to breathe. Then, of course, there are microbes, single-celled organisms that do not need oxygen to extract energy. They perform anaerobic cellular respiration. We talked about it, when they use something other than oxygen as the final electron acceptor in their respiratory chains, or they perform fermentation. They don't even do cellular respiration, they do fermentation to extract energy from food. And these are all examples of a fit between an organism and its environment. So how does natural selection work? Well, you've heard the phrase survival of the fittest, but what does it really mean? So in nature, there's a tendency towards overproduction. Many living organisms produce a lot of offspring. However, if you look at the sizes of the populations of these organisms, the size of those populations do not increase. They remain relatively constant. Additionally, resources that these organisms use also remain relatively constant over time. So how can we explain the huge production of offspring versus very little change in population size and very little change in resources needed? Well, it is the conclusion that can be drawn from these observations is that not all of the offspring survive. And we know that now for a fact that for many organisms, only a small proportion of their offspring will survive. So there is a competition for survival, a competition for reproduction. So who survives and who reproduces? Well, variations. All life forms vary genetically within a population, and it is this genetic variation upon which selection will work, right? So some of these variations are due to genetic differences, and they can be inherited. And natural selection acts on these variations. So individuals which have favorable variations, and again, they have to be heritable variations. So variations in phenotype that are actually inherited, they have a genetic component. So individuals that have favorable variation for their specific environment will live longer, will leave more offspring than individuals with unfavorable variations. So the individuals with favorable variations have adaptations to their environment. And again, these variations and these adaptations are specific for a specific environment. If the environment were to change, what used to be an adaptation may no longer be one. Okay, and of course it takes time. The genetic makeup of the resulting population of organisms will change as they become better adapted to their environment over time. And I want to remind you that population refers to all the individuals of the same species within a given geographic location. So you also need to remember that it is the population, right, that will evolve, that will change over time, not an individual organism. So change does not happen to an individual organism. It does not happen in an individual's organism lifetime. The change occurs over many generations. It takes time, and it changes either the population or the whole species. Okay, define fitness. We talked about fitness in Unit 3. Fitness is what? The ability of an organism to survive and reproduce. Survive and reproduce. Survival on its own is not sufficient. You need to reproduce, and you need to reproduce successfully. Okay, so again, I'm going to stress this again and again. Individuals do not evolve. It is the populations that evolve over time. And the other thing that is important to remember here is that natural selection can only increase or decrease heritable traits that vary in a population. Adaptations vary with different environment. So natural selection cannot select for traits that are not present in the population. Natural selection can only act on variations that are present in the population and they're heritable. And also, what is an adaptation in a current environment may change to no longer be a favorable trait and therefore no longer be an adaptation should the environment change. So keep that in mind when thinking about natural selection. Okay, so Darwin, again, never used the word evolution in his original book called The Origin of the Species. He used the phrase descent with modification. And again, this phrase refers to the fact that all organisms are related through descent from an ancestor that lived in the remote past. And that descent with modification is usually represented by models called phylogenetic trees or the tree of life. Sometimes people call it the tree of life. And it represents that very fact that we all descended from a common ancestor and we branched off and we're now very different. We do have something in common, we're also very different. Fossils of extinct species will help us fill the gaps between the present day animals and those ancient ancestors we all had. So we talk about natural selection. Now we're going to talk a little bit about artificial selection. Now, artificial selection has been in play for many, many years and was one of the evidences used by Darwin, one of the observations used by Darwin to help him develop his theory. So artificial selection is something that humans have been doing for as long as human memory has lasted, really. And that is basically selective breeding. Humans would take living organisms with useful traits and breed them together to select for these traits. Before there was Mendel, before we knew about genes, before we had even the theory of, before we had developed our knowledge about genetics and traits and genes and chromosomes and dominant and recessive traits, humans of all kinds of different cultures and all kinds of different tribes have artificially bred either animals or plants that have been useful to them to select for certain traits. So they had that genetics knowledge already in them. So here's an example, a fairly modern example of artificial selection. So essentially humans are affecting evolution by artificially selecting traits that are useful. So, and they decided to breed small poodles in this example, called teacup poodles. So out of the whole population of poodles, they select the smallest individuals in generation one. They breed those small individuals to create a second generation of poodles. And now you can see that again, because size is a heritable trait, they'll select only the poodles in generation two that have a certain size, breed them, and eventually, many generations later, generation N, all the offspring will be tiny little poodle dogs, which are called teacup poodles, okay? Now, of course, this might be like a cosmetic, silly, pet-like story. You know, humans are breeding dogs that have different shapes and sizes, and dogs are all the same species, but the different breeds of dogs are the result of artificial selection. But there has been also very, very useful and essential to human survival examples of artificial selection. Corn, modern corn, is descended from a plant called teosinte, and over many, many different generations of breeding, humans have bred for specific trait this particular plant, and now the result is modern corn. So this is not to be confused with genetically modified organism, because actually many of corn plants in the US are genetically modified, which is completely different, right? So the genetic makeup of the organism has been modified with foreign DNA. This is simply selective breeding. So we only select plants which have certain characteristics, breed them with each other in order to obtain offspring plants that look like and taste like and have certain nutritional values that we value. So modern corn is the result of artificial selection. Here's even a more drastic example, and I love this example. So the wild mustard plant, Brassica rapa, has been bred by humans to generate all of these vegetables. All right, and believe it or not, they're all the same species. So if you were to select for plants that have large leaves, you get yourself a kale. If you were to select plants that have large flowers, you get broccoli. If you were to select with plants that have large side buds, you get Brussels sprouts. If you were to select with plants that have large apical tip buds, where the plant grows, you get yourself cabbage. And selection for stems will lead kohlrabi. So all of these vegetables are the same species, and they're the product of artificial selection by humans. So humans have manipulated their crops, humans have manipulated their domesticated animals in order to select for specific desirable traits. Okay, and I'm going to stop right here, and we're going to finish this next lecture.